On behalf of Goldman Sachs and the entire 1 Million Black Women team, I am honored to welcome you to the 1 Million Black Women cohort of Empower Her, Empowering Black Girls to Lead program.
Research shows that investing in Black women can raise the U.S. GDP up to $525 billion annually.
In 2021, Black employees made up only 9% of the STEM field, a number that we need to change. It's programs like this that are pivotal and key to changing this narrative.
So the King Center has the largest repository in the world of primary source material related to Dr. King. And a couple of years ago, the King Center partnered with Microsoft on a preservation project. The neat thing about this is that you can actually engage with the various artifacts within the gallery. So for instance, if you go to a real museum, you can walk up and read about the painting, etc. You can do the same thing here. So as you click on various assets, descriptions open up to tell you more about that aspect and helps to walk you through the stories.
So I prepared a scavenger hunt for you to go all around this campus, learning some of the principles, some of the steps, some of the philosophy, some of the history. And what you're going to do as a team is go out and find the clues. There's a little plus sign in front, like on top of what it says clue list. That is how you can upload your selfies.
Go outside and follow the path to learn how to be a non-violent leader who lives courageously. 6 principles are painted so bold and so bright.
Bro, we right here.
All right, ready? 1, 2, 3.
Hi everyone, I'm Kai. One thing I realized was the eternal flame outside. I didn't realize at first that it was also a symbol of unity.
I didn't know that Yolanda was the oldest.
I'm gonna be honest with y'all, I didn't know that they were buried together.
I didn't know that Coretta was 2 years older than Dr. King.
I didn't know that Coretta went to college to study music.
I didn't know about Gandhi's influence on Martin Luther King and his wife, Coretta. And I noticed how Gandhi developed a method using nonviolent protesting called like satyagraha. And as we were traveling around the campus, I noticed how that was the influence that had on Dr. King.
You were created in the image and after the likeness of God. You have the power in you, if you would just believe it, to transcend the craziness that's around you. You can think at a higher level. You can destroy darkness and negativity in your mind.
Planted at the King Center, each infinity rosebush represents a cohort of empowered young women who have passed through our program.
I pledge to embody the essence of love in action. Becoming a beacon of light for our nation and our world.
Becoming a beacon of light for our nation and our world.
Nonviolence is the answer to the crucial political and moral questions of our time. The need for man to overcome oppression and violence without resorting to violence and oppression. Man must evolve for all human conflict a method which rejects revenge, aggression, and retaliation. The foundation of such a method is love.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. changed the world when he demonstrated what could be achieved through nonviolence. Now, you can learn how to live and practice this philosophy yourself through Nonviolence 365 Online, an innovative digital experience developed by the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change. Nonviolence 365 Online features extensive video interviews with real nonviolence practitioners, including the King Center CEO Dr. Bernice A. King, King Center certified instructors and trainers, and veterans of the civil rights movement. Explorations of the historic campaigns that helped Dr. King forge his philosophy. Immersive, annotated reading experiences that enhance Dr. King's most influential writings on nonviolence, custom activities, including quizzes and interactive scenarios to help you practice along the way, real-world exercises to help you start applying nonviolence in your daily life. Nonviolence 365 is a love-centered way of thinking, speaking, engaging, and acting that leads to personal, cultural, and societal transformation. It isn't just a concept for philosophers or political leaders. Nonviolence 365 is a powerful, practical approach to dealing with conflict and dismantling injustice. Whether it's in your personal life, in your school or workplace, your local community, or a national movement. Dr. King, Mrs. Coretta Scott King, and many others sought to create the beloved community, a society built on global cooperation and equity. This wasn't a lofty utopian dream. It's a realistic and achievable goal because each and every one of us has the power to make it happen by committing to nonviolence as a way of life. Take the first step today with Nonviolence 365 online.
Good evening, hello everyone, and welcome to this very special part one of the King Center's beloved community talk series, Voter Education and Responsibility. I am pleased to be moderating this first part of what we believe at the King Center is a critical series of conversations to educate us on what it means to vote, how we vote, who we're voting for, how to determine what policies we care about, what policies are on the table, what politicians believe what, and most importantly, how that all comes together to cause us to be a part of creating the beloved community, which is a realistic vision of an achievable society, our founder, Mrs. Coretta Scott King, said. And as our vision at the King Center says, it's where injustice ceases and love prevails. We don't want to belabor. We want to get this conversation started and invite each of you right now to share this broadcast, to go ahead and start to say you're watching it, paying attention, tuning in, using the hashtag the King Center. We want to shift the culture, so also use the hashtag shift the culture and just invite people in. Anybody who you know is wondering, what does this voting process even mean and why does it matter? We want you to invite them in, tag some people on Facebook, invite some people to tune in on X, share the YouTube link if you're watching via YouTube, but we want as many people as possible to be engaged, to be educated, to be informed, and to know why it matters that we pair our right to vote with our responsibilities as a voter. And so, as we get started with this conversation, we want to invite our CEO of the King Center, Dr. Bernice King, to come on now as we get started and provide a bit of an intro about this series, why it matters, and what we're talking about over these next several weeks at the King Center as we near a presidential election. Welcome, Dr. King.
Good evening to you and good day to everyone else, wherever you are in this
Absolutely.
world. We are delighted to have this conversation tonight. It's so critically important to where we are as a nation. And so I want to thank you, Dr. West, and our guests that will join us for this conversation.
Thank you, Dr. King. Thank you for having us and for believing that this is a series of conversations that has to happen as we approach this election. But I know it's also important to you, and you've emphasized that people not just know about presidential elections, but we're also aware about the political process and the need for civic engagement beyond the presidential office. So can you talk about that for a moment? Where are we and why is it important to know local voting?
Yeah, I mean, we all collectively make up our democracy. Without us, there is no democracy. Without our participation, there is no real democracy. And so, what I find often is, especially during those years where we have a presidential election, there's a lot of excitement that's generated around getting out the vote. And while that is important, what seems to be consistently lacking is voter education. And it does not mean that there are not entities and organizations who are doing it, but I think we need to better amplify voter education so that people really understand that there's a lot at stake from your, local town all the way up to the federal government and your state offices. In fact, a lot of things that affect us on a day-to-day basis is occurring at the state level and the municipal level. And so, and ironically, what impacts us the greatest has the lowest voter turnout, which is our municipal election and statewide elections. It seems like the excitement and the involvement, accelerates when we have a presidential election. So I hope that what we are doing, as well as others, I saw my sister Tamika Mallory doing something on Civic 101, and so many other people are doing it behind the scenes now in this election. But I hope this is something that we begin to be a part of the norm and not just in an emergency or crisis or moment. Because the better educated we are, the better engaged we are, the more accountable we can hold the individuals who represent us in office, even if they're not the ones that we voted for. So this is why we're having this conversation, because as we know, even at the younger level, civics is no longer taught in school. It used to be, remember on television, I'm just a bill, I'm only a bill sitting on top of here. We used to watch that as children growing up. And we need to bring that
You're telling
back.
some things. You're telling some things.
Yes, I am. I'm telling my beautiful age.
Yes, absolutely.
But yes, so we have some people who are very knowledgeable and experienced in this area that we are delighted to join us tonight. And this is not going to be the only conversation. Look forward to others to follow, because we really want you to understand simple stuff like what is the role of a president, because so often people get confused that presidents don't pass the laws. It's Congress, but presidents have other powers that we need to be aware of that's equally important. But these are things that we just have to make sure that people are understanding as a part of this process. So thank you again for helping us to moderate this conversation, and I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you, Dr. King. Just as we prepare to bring on our guests for this conversation, I want to remind you of a speech from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Let Us March on Ballot Boxes, which I believe, Dr. King, reminds me over the last few days, as I've listened to it again and thought about it, of voting, that voting is a form of nonviolent direct action. Can be. I think it's a way that we, it depends on how responsibly we do it. But just him saying, we're going to march, but let us march on ballot boxes, to consider voting as a way that we express our beliefs, our voices, the way we raise our voices. So as we have this conversation, I want you all to share the hashtag as you're posting about this today, and sharing the YouTube link and sharing the Facebook broadcast and letting people know that you're tuning in. Also include the hashtag marching on ballot boxes. Let's put that in there as we're sharing, marching on ballot boxes, hashtag marching on ballot boxes, as we welcome now Mr. Robert Brandon, who is the president and CEO of Fair Election Center. Mr. Brandon, they do some great work on voter education at the Fair Election Center. And we want to welcome Bob, as he prefers to be called, to our conversation today.
I think he's on mute there.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. And we also want to welcome Mr. Rohit Malhotra, founder and executive director of the Center for Civic Innovation, to our conversation. They have a campaign right now, Vote ATL, which is helping to educate and inform the people of the great city of Atlanta about why we should vote and what voting entails. Welcome, Rohit.
I'm so grateful to be here. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you both so much for joining us. Just want to go right into this quote from Dr. King. He said, voting is the foundation stone for political action. And we were talking before we even got started, Bob and Rohit, about what that means. That sometimes we may hear people say, I don't want to be too political. And we think that's because we made politics so convoluted, so that it's not simply about policies that affect people and the politicians who cultivate those policies. So we wanted to start with the question, how can we help change how we do politics, but also help get rid of some of the misunderstandings about what politics entail? So we'll start with you, Bob.
Yeah, well, so at the Fair Election Center, we have a motto. It's every year, every vote. We are in the courts litigating. We do voter education. We have a very large program with college campuses around the country. And it's really premised on the fact that democracy works best when all of our voices are heard. And, you referenced Dr. King. I always like to talk about another famous speech he gave at the Lincoln Memorial in 1957, which became sort of referred to as the "Give Us the Ballot" speech. It was there really to try to move the then Eisenhower administration to take seriously the Brown versus Board of Education decision. But he pretty specifically said that and called out, the conniving methods used to keep people from registering, the African-American people, and that denial of that sacred right was a tragic betrayal to the highest mandate of the democratic tradition. And he said, our most urgent request right now is to get Congress to give us the right to vote. And of course, there was the 13th Amendment, and allegedly freed slaves had the right to vote, but we know what followed with Jim Crow and everything. And I think, he understood, and we all understand, that there's a direct connection between the vote and addressing the inequities our country has perpetuated, but also being able to promote the opportunities that it promises. So, the vote is so important. And as you were saying, when we have to make sure people understand that they don't mix up politics for making their voice heard. Because frankly, if they don't like the way the politics are, if they get involved, politics becomes better because it reflects more of their interests.
Wow, that is I think a very insightful way to look at it, Bob. If we don't like politics, get involved, because if we're involved, politics become better because they reflect us. That's people power. We have to believe again we can have people power. Rohit, how can we uncomplicate this? Can you expound a bit on that and share more about what you heard Bob convey there?
Yeah, so Dr. King said that voting is the foundation stone for political action. That's the quote that we are talking about. And Dr. King, you know that your father was extremely intentional about the construction of every word that he spoke and every word that he wrote. And so for me, when you take that actual phrase, you have to look at the words foundation stone, not just because of the biblical reference of foundation stone, but foundation stone in its true meaning, that a foundation stone is the first stone that you lay for something that has not yet been constructed. That a foundation stone is supposed to spark courage and faith to imagine a world that does not yet exist and that requires deep hope and courage. And so for me, the difference between politics and political action is that politics begins and ends with an election and a vote. It's a game that involves winners and losers, and it, in its worst sense, politics taps into the most dangerous form of human thinking, which is binary thought. That if you can make things either this or that, and you can create a world of winners and losers where you are either completely for or against something, you can remove the nuance of complexity and identity from things. It actually breaks the most beautiful part of democracy, which is the struggle toward understanding through complex thought. And it reduces people to either this or that. But political action is a culture. It's a habit. It doesn't begin or end with an election. It actually forces us to ask ourselves, what is the moral position that we want reflected inside of our public policy? That legislation and budgets are not just pieces of paper, that they are truly moral documents, and that every single step of this country's history has required us to have to modify those documents in order to make sure that people were included in the law of the land. And so to me, politics is a moment, but political action is truly the movement.
I knew you wanted to share about that, Dr. King.
Well, no. What I wanted to say, just in listening, is that we as a people kind of really are responsible for breaking through all of the difference between politics and political action. You know, the belief is that they're being political because that's what the people require. But the more educated and informed we become, we help to elevate the way in which they begin to campaign. You know, people take advantage of uninformed people. Some people would say of ignorant people. And so that's why what we're talking about tonight is so important, because the more educated the citizenry, the less, I believe, politics we'll see. And people will then have to not try to, you know, divide and attack. They'll have to really talk about their platform and the issues that they're committed to, and make that delineation clear without having to diminish another individual. And so part of that action is our education, because as we know, all a part of that movement that my father and them were engaged in, people look at direct action, but the people were educated and prepared in that direct action. They weren't just doing action. So the education part is so essential to the political action.
Thank you, Dr. King. Bob, are you wanting to add to that or share something about that?
You know, as I mentioned, we have a program which is called the Campus Vote Project. It's in its 12th year, and it's an effort to get colleges and universities around the country to take up the responsibility to educate their students about the importance of voting, about how they can register and how they can vote. And we partner with them. We have about 360 partner institutions with over 4 million students enrolled on those campuses. And when I started that process and talked to college chancellors and presidents, they would admit that this is their responsibility. In fact, it's often in the mission statement of most universities and colleges that they're supposed to provide education for becoming full citizens. And but then they would say, this sounds awfully political, and say, no, it's educating the next generation of voters, and it's your responsibility. And over the years, schools have really embraced that more fully. And it's important because, you know, with this presidential election, we'll have 14 million new voters who turned 18 since the last presidential election. And many of them will be first-time voters in November. And they need to know what to do, and they need help in that. And that's something we can all provide support for. And also to recognize that the things that young people are passionate about, whether it's criminal justice reform or gun violence or equity or access to women's health or tuition and investment in education, those things are decided by people, not just the president of the United States. And it's really important that they learn, and every other voter learns, where decisions get made and why it's so important to look at the state legislature and the governor and the county prosecutors, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's really very, very important part of what we need to do. The other thing I'll just mention is that we've now seen, I started this organization a little over 18 years ago. It was the year 2006 when the first photo ID law was passed in this country. So voter suppression had its ugly earlier decades for sure. And it was very explicit when they kept people from voting or shooting people when they were trying to register folks to vote in the South and elsewhere. But the new generation of voter suppression is more subtle, but very calculated and very specific. And it can come as easily as shortening the amount of time somebody gets to turn around an absentee ballot, or making it harder to help people who are in line, as you all know in Georgia, to provide snacks and water for somebody waiting 3 or 4 or 5 hours in a line is now illegal. What I like to say is the best election protection we have is voter education. And that's on all of us. We all have to provide help and encouragement for whether it's young people and first-time voters, or our neighbors, or people at church, or in your school, or wherever at work. We need to encourage everybody to be informed voters and to understand how to cast a ballot, because their voice has to be heard.
Thank you for that. Thank you. You know, one of the concerns that a lot of voters have, registered voters, but then one of the impediments to people registering to vote, particularly when a presidential election is involved, is the Electoral College. So we want to talk about that for a moment. What is the fierce urgency of voting, going back to our title, when it seems like the popular vote may not matter? How do we get people engaged if they're looking and they're saying, my vote doesn't even matter in a presidential election? Why does it matter? What's the fierce urgency of voting, given some of the things we've seen historically, even though it may appear as though the popular vote doesn't matter? We have that question on a slide that we want to put up as well, just so we can let people see it in front of them too. But we'll start with you, Rohit. What's the fierce urgency of voting in a time where it may even look like the popular vote doesn't matter?
Well, I think that I think we have to explore the premise of why voter education right now is difficult for folks, and and why people have a deep mistrust. Trust is broken. It's at historic lows between people and institutions, particularly government. And a lot of that comes from the fact that even when people do vote, they don't feel a sense of accountability from the people that they elected. And so, folks show up at the at the cookouts and the barbecues, and they kiss babies and cut ribbons during election season, but then they ghost us when those election seasons are over. And so I think there is a full reason why people have completely mistrust information, and it is ripe for misinformation to enter into the sphere. So there is, I think it's very difficult to start the conversation on like, hey, it's so important you vote. It's so urgent. People are like, all right, well, sure, it might be urgent for you, but my neighborhood has looked the exact same under the last 4 presidents. And so I don't know what you're talking about, right? Like, how can you possibly say my vote actually matters? And that's because a lot of what we talk about and care about nationally actually plays out locally. And so what politics looks like locally is how we interpret what's going on nationally. And so if my neighborhood has had sidewalks that have not had any attention paid to them, or when you talk about public safety in someone else's neighborhood, you talk about green space, but when you talk about it in my neighborhood, you talk about policing. What we've done is that we have created a dishonest discourse around voting. So it is urgent for those who understand the complexities of these systems that in over years have created a lot of harm. And then it tries to tell people that this is a hopeful system. And so I think we have to stop leading with purely this imaginary tale that government has been good to people. It has hurt a lot of people. And if we can have an honest conversation about that, then people say, okay, if you're willing to acknowledge where I'm starting with my relationship to government, now I'm willing to actually have the conversation on education of what it is or what it isn't. But we have such broken trust. No one wants to be educated by someone that they do not trust. And it is why people have been, the folks who push misinformation are so effective, is because they start with the concept of building trust, even if it's manipulative, and they are able to get information in the hands of folks. And so for me, this fierce urgency of now, absolutely. Government can do a lot. I mean, in the hands of the wrong people can accelerate harm much faster than it can accelerate progress. And we know that. We have seen that locally and nationally. But I think the fierce urgency comes from us forcing a more honest conversation about what the role of government is in people's lives and what it has the potential to do, but also what it does not have the power to do for people. I think it's just the now is a more honest conversation.
So it connects back to Rohit. It sounds like the voter responsibility in education, but also accountability from elected officials. Yeah. And starting there and saying, you know, we have to really talk about not only what our role is as voters, but when somebody's elected, how can they not do harm? We
always talk about responsibility on the voter, but there is a responsibility on government to actually create an ecosystem environment to actually give people the space to vote, right? There is I think you see that in the power of the vote is not just the right to vote, but how scary it is when people say that I'm not going to vote. That's the power. That's the real power that people are waving around, and it's what we're most afraid of, and it's what we need to have a more honest conversation about.
Thank you for sharing that. Dr. King, Bob?
Yeah, I just wanted to say I agree with Rohit 100%, but I want to challenge something, because we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, is very important in this conversation. While I certainly agree that there's a lot of harm been done by elected officials, I also think that there's been a lot of harm done by those collectively. And I'm speaking that there aren't people, again, like the work that Bob is doing that's so critically important, and what you're doing that's critically important. But there's a responsibility, even past the elected official, on those of us in leadership who know and understand the political process and the importance of civic engagement, to ensure that our communities are educated and informed, because the only reason these people are doing harm is because they know they can get away with it. They know that we have taught people, we've almost trained, especially in the Black community. And I think people miss my father on this. We train people to focus on voting. We have not trained and enlightened people on their civic responsibility. We have not educated people on what it means to be civically engaged. So everything becomes about politics instead of civic, responsibility and engagement. So I agree with what you're saying. But, things have kind of deteriorated because we show up and then we disappear. Not you per se, not those that you work with per se, but there's a large body of people that are taking advantage of every election during the time, like you said, it's time to vote. And there are those of us that are in civic leadership responsibility throughout the year that fail to do our part. And I'm first starting with me. We should do more to ensure people understand so that it's not reactionary, not so that we're not in crisis mode. Because what I get tired of is that most times we find out about stuff when it's almost too, I wouldn't say it's never too late, but it seems like it's almost too late, and then we're trying to rally the troops. And I think that was the power of my movement, my father's movement. I won't call his movement, the people's movement that was led by my father and so many others, is that they had this ongoing engagement. In fact, they created some of the work that you all are now doing as a part of what they were doing. And there was that synergistic relationship going on. So I wanted to add that point because, we got to make these people honest year round. Because now they know, hey, just put me in and I'll go do your bidding. But they don't hear from us. They don't see it. They don't see us until it's real, like out of control. And then we're showing up like fire persons, so I just wanted to add that bit.
Both of you make really good points that it's not enough to vote. You've got to hold people accountable. Also, as Rohit mentioned, and all of you that have done work in direct action or organizing generally, I know I've seen it. I did a lot of work. I've done a lot of work on healthcare, and I see people taking the lead in fighting for access to healthcare who eventually become elected officials, and they become elected officials because they recognize it's an extension of the leadership that they've had in the community, and those people still have to, and they also have to be held accountable. But it's much more likely that they'll be reflective of the needs of the community because they've been a leader of the community. And I do think I'm always an optimist. We need to get more people to vote and be educated about the different decisions that are made that affect their lives, because a lot of people just may vote for president, may vote for the Senate, may not vote for anybody in the legislature. And, we've had in many places, just like it's happened with voter suppression, another form of voter suppression is all the gerrymandering that goes on. So we have, unfortunately, many legislative districts, whether it's in Congress or in the state legislature, where people are in office and don't ever have to worry about being accountable because they have a rigged system where they choose their voters rather than the voters choosing them. It's interesting now that, for example, in Michigan, a group called Citizens Not Politicians put on the ballot in Michigan. Unfortunately, a lot of states don't have ballot initiatives, but Michigan did, to completely revamp the way legislative districts were going to be created. And it was done by a citizens commission, and it's completely changed the state of Michigan. Ohio has one on the ballot this November, and it will take back the drawing of legislative maps to a citizens commission. And rather than having, again, politicians choose their voters, it's going to be the voters choosing the politicians.
Dr. West, I know you asked a very important question of us. that honestly I can't answer.
No, it's okay.
But I want Bob to answer this question because I think it's important. You know, the question posed around the presidential election, and the fact that many people feel like the Electoral College kind of trumps, no pun intended, my vote. So why even participate? What is the purpose? And that's a question that comes from all kinds of people. So if you can help us to understand that, how do we explain to people how critically important, their popular vote is in light of this Electoral College?
And again, I think we touched on it before. So many decisions that are being made that affect people's lives on an everyday basis are not based on what the president can do or not do. They're based on state government, local government, and obviously there's some big picture things. But there are. I know there are examples where people say, well, if they're just focused on the presidency, what does it matter if I vote? Because this state's going to go all the way one way or all the way the other way. I would just say, we at some level we get the government we deserve. So if we're not engaged, because frankly, you could have an out of control president. Don't want to characterize any recent presidents that way, but you might want to. Limits are put on by other branches of government. And that's important. Just as we have a Supreme Court now that's out of control, we need to have limits placed on the Supreme Court. In my view, as a trained lawyer, it's very concerning to me, the direction of the court. But I just think in some ways, the people that want to narrowly control the system benefit from voters deciding it's not worth their vote. And I just think we have to not accept that. We have to educate people that there's much that they can do to make a difference. And like I said, if it's the presidential race and you don't think you have a role to play because of the way the Electoral College works, you have a role to play in electing other people in different levels of government. And many of those people choose judges that make decisions at the state level, for example.
And that's a part of the education, I think, Bob, is that, it all comes together. But as Rohit is pointing out too, when people have a barrier that may not be something put in place by government, but because they've encountered so many issues with government, they're thinking, does my vote even matter? I think that's why these conversations are so important, because we have the realization that I do have this opportunity to have a say. And then I also have to, in between my voting, put in the work to cause shifts in how elections even work and shifts in how government engages people. And so I have this ongoing civic engagement that Dr. King was mentioning a few minutes ago, that it all starts to work together if we take the time to say, why does this election matter? What does the president do? What does the vice president do? What does the Supreme Court do? My 15-year-old niece told me when I was recently sharing with her that presidents nominate people to the Supreme Court, that she didn't know that. And they just talked about the role of the president in her civics class in high school. And so I think that's something we start to share. People might not know the presidential role affects the Supreme Court. Well, what does the Supreme Court do? All of this, I think, in terms of education, impacts our local and our national engagement. What are some ways that we can get more of this education out there and get people more civically involved in the local community? And I also want to ask, based on what each of you have shared, how important is it right now that we do some intensive civic leadership training for our young people and our young adults and our older adults? Some civic leadership training where sometimes when it's time for elections, I'm wondering where the candidates came from. Like, how do we get a pool of candidates who care more about people, who are more diverse, who have some different ideas? How important is it now? Civic leadership and local engagement. Can you share your thoughts on how we enhance in those areas? Start with you, Rohit. Come back around again.
Yeah, I think it's having these conversations outside of election years. I think that trust is built between elections, and elections are a reflection of the trust that we built before they happen. So if you see people scrambling at the last minute, it is because they refused to do the actual work when the lights and the cameras were off. And so I think that right now cameras are on. We got a historic election for so many reasons. So everybody's, gonna put their best face on during these elections. Everybody all of a sudden agrees, and everybody believes that we need to go in one direction or another, when just literally 10 days ago, the Democratic Party itself was about to split historically in a way that it never had before, because it was unwilling to have an honest conversation about what people felt and whether people felt actually heard or not. And, I know that I want to make it very clear. I am not a pessimist by any means. I love my city and I love my people too much to not have a more honest conversation about why we keep getting stuck in the same scenarios over and over again. It is not because people on the ground are having a conversation about the Electoral College. Yes, these state governments are doing some crazy things. Just this past week, Georgia has been trying to pull a fast one on the people to be able to change rules around elections and how elections would actually be certified. So I am not confused about the fact that there are systematic things that are there, but trust is built on the ground. And on the ground, it is beautiful. Like people are showing up for each other in ways that no politics could possibly capture. They are doing it in spite of the politics that are happening. If we can show them and reframe that is politics, that is what government could look like, if you can reframe someone's imagination that the things that they find to be most beautiful about democracy is actually the possibility of government, you can get people excited again. You can get people to believe in this system, and you'll get people to say, I'm down to run. But if you look at the folks who were protesting in Ferguson, the folks who have been protesting in Minnesota, the folks who were protesting on the streets of Atlanta, organizers and people who are trying to push this type of work are hurting. We are losing on the ground organizers on a daily basis, because to do this work against the machine of folks who turn political action into politics, to go back to that phrasing, there is a uphill battle. So the question for us is, how do we invest in this work outside of election seasons? Number two, how do we make sure that the folks on the ground who are actually doing the work are the credible messengers that help us build the trust that is required to do political education? And then from there, how do we sustain people in this work? Like, if you got a bunch of people who are just constantly fundraising to make sure that they can live another day, and the only way they can fundraise is to do voter registration drives rather than true political education, community building, and canvassing, then you've allowed the nonprofit industrial complex to take over the actual civic work that is required for us to achieve and to see progress. Last thing I'll say is, like, a lot of voter education work and voter registration and turnout work was created by a sector that was trying to fight up against folks who were doing real organizing work in the first place. That if donors could actually put money to evade the harder conversations about why in a place that has abundance are still people fighting to we had lines 3 miles long for people to get canned foods during COVID, like in the country of abundance. And so if we can break these things down to ask these questions, like, why does this exist? How is this happening? And how do we use political structures to actually deal with people's reality on a day-to-day basis? I think then we'll actually start to get people to trust this process again. Like, and trying to get people to jump in right now and just be like, okay, now educate yourself, get ready, let's go. It reminds me of my dad. My dad, during the Super Bowl, the last Super Bowl, we were like, Dad, you should come watch the Super Bowl. He goes, I've already seen that. And when people don't actually understand the sport and haven't been involved in things on a day-to-day basis, they're asking them to get involved in the Super Bowl moment is not going to get them excited because they didn't didn't have the time to actually understand how the game is played, and politics truly is a game. So I'm optimistic, but I think if we want to build greater civic engagement among people, I think it starts with how do we use trusted messengers, people who are on the ground already, to make sure that we're actually hearing people and not just talking at people for the purposes of political advantageous action.
Thank you. I heard you say trusted messengers, Rohit, and also ongoing engagement. Like in these, we can't have off years. That we have to continue to, because in order to get into this place of action, truly, and civic engagement, always, we have to always be talking about how do policies affect poverty? You talked about the people in the line. And we were sharing before we got started that for Dr. King, the two were connected, that he believed by shifting policies and having humane policies in the interest of creating a beloved community, you could actually eradicate poverty and use policies to get health care for people. So there's this connection there. Bob, what do we do to increase this engagement?
I'm an optimist as well, and I do agree with Rohit. It's organizing year-round that's really important. Mentioned earlier, really pushing the high schools to have civics again, really pushing the colleges and universities to teach the basics about civic education. But that's only the beginning. You really have to think about, as I mentioned earlier, everybody's potential leadership in making a difference. And I know we hire about 400 students every year to work on their campuses with their administration and faculty. We call them Democracy Fellows. And not only are they doing that work, but we're providing leadership development programming for them. We're teaching them about the history of social movements, about organizing, about the civil rights movement and voting rights. Really, the whole idea being, so when they leave, when they graduate, they have a sense of the power they have as a young person and the things that they can do by pulling people together. I hope we now have had about 5,000 students go through our program over the last 12 years. And, basically many of them are going on to continue to do some kind of work to make social change. And that's really important.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I still think the faith communities play a critical role in this as well. And what Rohit was saying, obviously people who are tied to a church trust their leaders there. I mean, I'm not saying everybody in that community does, but the people do. And so things always happen from the people level. We didn't get the Civil Rights Act because Johnson signed it into law readily. There was work that the people did. And so we all have circle of influences and connectivity where this year-round work has to happen, and it has to become a priority. We got to check our priorities in this nation. To me, we become a very entertainment culture, celebrity culture. Everything is kind of infused around that. And we don't prioritize what affects us more on a day-to-day basis. We're more interested on the next, song or the all the different sports, who's playing who. And I'm not saying people shouldn't have fun and all that kind of stuff, but we're in a serious place right now. And you can still have fun, but also realize that this has to be a priority. And priority means it becomes a part of a way of life on an ongoing basis. I know there's this whole notion, we don't talk politics around our table. Well, we don't have to talk politics. Let's just talk about things that matter to us in this world, that impact us in this world, that impact the people we love in this world. Let's just have that conversation with our circles, and don't even put it on a political realm. And let's just kind of imagine together, what it could look like differently. And maybe we can get around, to what is the vehicle for that, being able to take place, which obviously will eventually lead to some kind of policy decision. But we always start debating an issue rather than talking about what matters, what we care about. And we also think that only certain people have the responsibility. We all have a responsibility because every one of us has influence, whoever you are. We know that. Gang members got influence, obviously. So let's use our influence where we are in these, we call them off years, but in between elections, to just begin to foster a sense of community around these important issues, so that when it's time for an election, we're not like, oh, it's time to vote. It's just a logical extension.
I think your point around faith-based communities is extremely important, because what we've done is we've replaced faith with politics. And so what has happened is that politics has become our faith rather than our faith driving our politics. And
Right.
so because of that, everything in politics has become a moral issue, because it is our faith, that you are not just voting against or for somebody. You are now voting for or against something that I truly believe in, rather than the complexity of politics, which is bringing someone into office does not mean that they are going to make or keep all the promises that they said they were. But I think that concept of we've lost what it means to use faith to build a morality that drives what we want to see in governance. We instead have just replaced it, think we can skip right ahead and say, and now here is our politics that will replace the harder conversation.
I wanted to just, before we wrap up, to just mention for people that are want to know how to navigate the rules, we have voting guides for all 50 states on our website, fairelectioncenter.org, and I welcome people, invite people to go there. And also, if you're doing voter registration drives, there, a number of states have made it harder, including Georgia and Texas and Florida, to do registration drives. You have to know what the rules are, and we also have guides for that as well. And then the last thing I want to mention is today happens to be National Poll Worker Recruitment Day. We haven't talked about the role that poll workers have played in helping their neighbors and protecting our elections. You've had some great examples in Georgia. People have sacrificed a lot for being poll workers, but I would just encourage everybody. It's a great way to help your neighbors navigate the rules and vote. It's a great starting thing. It pays money, and you can go meet your neighbors. And we encourage a lot of young people. We're recruiting college students all over the country to be poll workers, because once they start doing that, it becomes something that they'll become a lifelong interest of theirs.
This has been a tremendous conversation. I think to what we all have shared, I'll say all of this and then some. I think there's enough nuance in us and capacity in us as human beings to realize that things need to change. I realize that while I go to vote. I'll be driving to go to vote, and I'll be thinking to myself, we got to do something with these structures and these systems. Let me go in here and make my vote and raise my voice and do what I can in this situation. And also at the same time, look at my local community and say, what can I shift here? What can I be a part of? What can I do at this school? What can I do here? And then I'll just come back. It's like we don't have to decide. I don't believe everyone one or the other, that I'm I'm looking at this situation and how government sometimes fails us, so I don't have to be a part of electing officials. I can see that and also say, how do I get people in office who offer the best shot, if that's possible, the best opportunity? And then come back and say, well, they didn't do what I thought they would do. Let me come back again, that we kind of can't afford, really at this point in our history, to embrace a narrative that says voting doesn't matter. And I think that's why, Dr. King, we wanted to have these conversations to be educated. So coming up, and as we think about what's coming up, I want to pose one last question, because we'll begin to discuss the role of the president, the role of the vice president. We've been hearing a lot about that recently. Does the vice president even matter? You know, the role of Congress, the role of Supreme Court. And when we talk about education, as we continue to have these discussions, we'll have an episode of Beloved Community Talks on faith and democracy. I think what you've shared, Dr. King and Rohit, on faith and democracy, or faith and voting, is so important. What are the ideas or the sentiments that you want to leave people with about voting as we conclude this conversation, this part one of the King Center's Beloved Community Talk series on voter responsibility, voter education? What do you want to leave people with as they're listening to this conversation as we conclude this conversation today? We'll start with you, Bob.
Well, I think arm yourself with good information. As I mentioned, educate your neighbors and friends, encourage them to vote. Votes really do make a difference. We talk a lot to some of the young voters, as I mentioned, and when we tell them that the turnout of 18 to 24-year-olds in 2020 resulted in the youngest, most diverse Congress in history being elected, that makes a difference. They realize that their vote does make a difference. So everybody's vote will make a difference ultimately if they get together and vote. And as we've said before, hold the people accountable that you voted for.
Thank you. Rohit.
Yeah, I think for me, the thing I want to leave folks with is that fear is not a policy position. People don't feel inspired to do things and come out for things when you tell them to be against something. People are inspired by being for something. Having a position on reproductive rights and women's right to choose is a policy position. Having a position on our foreign and domestic affairs, these are policy positions. These are not, when you tell people, well, you got to do this because otherwise this bad thing is going to happen to you, is not a way to get people engaged and involved in process. And so I really want to encourage us that when we're having conversations about civic engagement, it's not just the fear of what may happen, but the possibility of what could happen for folks. And it matters. The last presidential election cycle in Georgia was decided by just a little over 11,000 votes. And in Atlanta, the last two mayoral races were decided by less than 1,000 votes. And so there is your voice actually really does matter in the decisions. And it's not just in the decisions of who gets to make decisions on our behalf, but who are they making those decisions for? I always tell people, I vote, so you got to deal with me. I want people to be very clear. You are going to have to deal with me, because I am a voter, and you are now responsible to work with me when I agree with you and working with me when I don't. And engagement itself doesn't just begin and end at the polling station. It begins in the neighborhood. It begins in the community. It begins at those school board meetings, those committee hearings, those neighborhood meetings, those cookouts. That's where real trust and engagement really, that's what gives me the most hope, is that people are already doing that. That's what comes natural. To break us apart, to make us feel like we are on opposite sides of each other, is actually what is unnatural. the most natural thing is for us to find opportunities to come together, have difficult conversations, and break through binary thought so that we can actually imagine what is possible to kind of live up to the expectations of every quote that your father has had on this issue. So that's what makes me optimistic and excited.
That's why these beloved community talks are here, to have these courageous conversations. Thank you for that. Dr. King.
Yeah, I would say a few things. One, voting matters. And when you don't feel like it matters or act like it matters, then those who are elected treat you like you don't matter. And so know that your engagement is important, your involvement, and that voting is just part of our responsibility in this whole continuum of civic engagement. And recognize that there's power in our collective. I still believe in we, the people. You're not alone. And that's why it's important that we all find an institution, a civic entity that is engaged in this kind of work that we connect with, so we don't feel alone, disconnected, and maybe detached from really what's going on. The more of us that connect and become a collective force on an ongoing basis, as we talked about in between elections, and it becomes a lifestyle, I believe we can elevate what's happening, in our country right now, and change the trajectory of all of the infighting and the conflict. Our disengagement through time has allowed it to atrophy to, I believe, to what it is today, because we take it for granted. We say, okay, my responsibility is just to vote. No, your responsibility is to be engaged holistically year round. You can't do it individually. And that's why Googling should be your friend. Find an organization in your community that you can be a part of and add that collective energy, so that we together can put the necessary pressure and bring the necessary accountability to those individuals who have been elected to office.
Thank you for that, Dr. King. Thank you to each of you, Bob, Rohit, Dr. King, for being a part of this conversation. We want to get folks ready for next week or the next time we have this conversation in part 2 of voter education and responsibility. Roles and responsibilities, the President of the United States, Thursday, August 15th at 6:30. We want everyone to be back here and to invite and bring with you in this virtual space at least 10 people. And we want you to start to write down your voter and civic engagement strategy. We want to help you. I'm going to develop a one-pager that we're going to share as the King Center, a one-page worksheet that helps you to develop a strategy for civic engagement beyond election days. What is your strategy? What are your local schools? Who are your local public officials? What is your strategy for civic engagement, so that you can say, look, this is a presidential year. This is a local election year. We're electing Congress people this year. And in between all of that, I know what's happening in schools. I know what's happening with my roads. I know what's happening in every part of the community that I live in, because that's important, that's critical. But as we're engaging in this series, let's learn, let's grow together, let's spend some time being educated. Let's understand that there might not be everything in place the way that we want it to be in our government, but we are the people, and we have a responsibility to engage government, to engage each other, and we can utilize government to create the beloved community. That's something popularized by Dr. King, coined by Reverend Josiah Royce, but we still believe at the King Center that we can create a place where injustice ceases and love prevails, and perhaps No, it is true indeed that if we strategically utilize we the people, our people power, our role in government, not just as voters, but as civic leaders, elected officials, community leaders, as people who understand how to connect, as Dr. King understood, power, love, and justice. We can create that beloved community. We can create a more just, humane, peaceful, equitable world, and we can do it together. Let's continue to engage in this series, Voter Education and Responsibility. We'll see you back here in 2 weeks, August 15th, as we continue our series. Continue it with roles and responsibilities, the President of the United States. Thank you for being a part. Continue to post, use that hashtag marching on ballot boxes, hashtag the King Center, hashtag shift the culture. Thank you again. See you soon.